Working in the field of trauma-informed care and trauma treatment too, myself, I think it's a common misunderstanding that we want to protect people from feeling bad. Mm-hmm. It's that we want to support people to be able to be with their experience of feeling bad.
Yeah.
And to grow their capacity to hold the complexity of life. Things are going to happen and we're not going to feel good. And how do we get through the not feeling good? Mm-hmm. It's not avoiding it or stopping it or preventing it from ever happening. Mm-hmm. It's really, what do we do when it does, and learning the skills necessary to be in a world that sometimes is threatening.
Will, welcome to Potent Truth.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I feel like this has been the conversation that I've been most excited about for the podcast. And for many reasons. One, just because of my personal journey through trauma my entire life, and really just now starting to dive deeper into trauma work and what that looks like, both on a personal level and also educating myself through Trauma and Somatics, which is yours and Ariana's program. Mm-hmm. But also with what we've been seeing in the world.
Yeah.
2020 hit, and that's a huge collective trauma, but it felt like, I don't know if you noticed this too, it felt like that collective trauma started to shake things up for a lot of people in a lot of different ways, which then brought forth their trauma to the surface.
Yeah, I think it did a good job of bringing it front and center for all of us. We can see it in social media and in the media in general, but especially in social media, the conversation about trauma existing, the existence of it, and then treatment modalities has seems to have kind of exploded. Gabor Mate created that documentary, right? And there were over 200 and some million people that saw it the first time. And they've run it a number of times now. And
yeah.
So I think we as a species are ready to turn towards this. And everything that happened really brought it to the surface. We can't not look at it anymore.
Yeah.
It's there for us to see, especially everybody being locked in their homes together.
Yeah.
You don't get a chance to get away from it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, what do you think really brought that on? And that is a good point. It's like when you're locked in your home, whether it's in solitude for those who were in solitude, or with your families, it really brings you face to face with the things that were unspoken or the things that we chose not to see, but now we can't help but see it because it's so in our face.
And the patterns that are still happening for many.
Yeah.
People who were struggling with addiction, they weren't leaving the home and the environment. They were there in it.
Yeah. I also found in the entrepreneurial space, a lot of things exploding because there's the fear of like, oh shit, the world is changing. And now my business isn't running as it used to. But to me, entrepreneurship is really an extension of personal development. And so it brought a lot of people's shit out, and saw a lot of projecting happening in the social media landscape, and a lot of polarization, which is still occurring. A lot of blaming, shaming, the rise of cancel culture.
Yeah, that's gotten real bad.
It's gotten horrific. I've heard of my friends' kids being suspended from school for things that, if it happened in our era, you would never get suspended. It would be a conversation.
I know. Yeah, it's kind of scary. To consider bringing a child into the world with the way things are right now. Or raising children with the way things are right now. I don't currently have children, but just even when I think about it, I think, gosh, it was not that way when we were younger. And our parents said the same thing. And yet the degree that it's changed is significant by comparison.
Yeah. The rise of digital technology has made that just a dangerous space for children.
Yeah, and there seems to be some sense of common decency that's missing these days.
Yes, kindness.
Respect. Yeah, kindness and respect, yeah.
Yeah. I remember being in school and the thing you would be scared about is just the bully in class.
Right.
But the teacher could intervene.
Right.
And now we have online bullying. We have the bullying that parents never see, never know about, never hear about, because the teachers don't even see it.
Yeah.
And then we have the bullying from the teachers to the kids because of the cancel culture and the things we're not allowed to talk about and things we can't talk about.
Yeah.
There's just so many rules now to navigate this journey as a human being.
Yeah.
That make it so much harder.
There really is. And, working in the field of trauma-informed care, this, and trauma treatment too, myself, I think it's a common misunderstanding that we want to protect people from feeling bad. It's not that we want to protect people from feeling bad or from their feelings being hurt. It's that we want to support people to be able to be with their experience of feeling bad.
Yeah.
And to grow their capacity to hold the complexity of life, because it is complex and things are going to happen and we're not going to feel good. And how do we get through the not feeling good? That it's not avoiding it or stopping it or preventing it from ever happening. It's really, what do we do when it does, and learning the skills necessary to be in a world that sometimes is threatening.
Well, that's the thing, is I think too many people, I think there's a lot of complacency in that space of, positive vibes only, or let's just like manifest our ways into this happy state, which then has you avoiding anything that doesn't feel quote unquote good.
Yeah.
But we're the ones giving these emotions the charges, like happiness is good and anger is bad.
Right.
And joy is good and grief is bad. And then add the cultural upbringings to it. Like, I was never allowed to feel sad.
Right.
Don't cry. How many people have heard that their entire lives? Don't cry. Don't be upset.
Yeah.
Or don't be angry.
Yeah. And now people are being taught to protect somebody else from feeling bad.
Yes.
And to apologize for somebody else feeling bad. I mean, that was happening when we were younger. Tommy apologized to Sally for hurting her feelings, for making her feel bad, or Sally apologized to Tommy for making him feel bad. And it's like, well, we want to learn responsibility for our actions and that they have an impact on other individuals. I think there's a more artful way that we can do that, where I'm not responsible for you disliking the words that I use.
Right.
Right. Can I be mindful? Absolutely. Can I be kind? Absolutely. And it's important for us to learn how to do those things. And if I'm accountable for your feelings, oh man, it's a dangerous world, because now I've got to preemptively guess what's going to feel good or bad to you. And I've got to filter my words based on what you want me to say.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous place for us to be culturally.
Yeah.
And we're finding ourselves in it. And I think that's a byproduct of trauma.
Yeah.
But we stir the puddle, so to speak, and all this stuff comes to the surface to be addressed. And I think that's where we are right now.
We're deep in the puddle.
Yep. As a species.
The puddle is deep. People are really biting their tongues a lot and treading in deep water, as well as walking on eggshells now with each other, which
Absolutely.
That doesn't have to be the way that we operate.
No.
And when you're speaking, what was interesting to me is this topic of impact over intention.
Yes.
Which I have gone around in circles with friends of. I've been accused of doing things in the past by people, my peers in personal development, and they'll be like, but it's the impact and not the intention. Or some people saying it's the intention and not the impact. And it's like, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right.
I think it's a lot more nuanced than that.
It is. Yeah.
And that's where we are, is in this place where people want to be so like it's black or white, blue or red, but there's this entire area in the middle that we also get to recognize, acknowledge, and play in.
Yeah.
And that's the nuance of trauma, I feel.
It is. Yeah. And everybody's affected a little bit differently.
Yeah. What's interesting is my journey back into the awareness of trauma. My entire life journey has been with a lot of big T traumas and the little T traumas in between. Big T trauma being like the big, huge traumas that happen that people recognize, and the little T's that, you know, oh, that affected me. It had an impact.
Yeah.
And when I got into personal development and coaching and started on this path of personal development and healing, a lot of that started to dissipate, and maybe it was just some little minor little T traumas. But last year I went through a huge trauma with my dog, and I was actually not conscious of the way that it impacted me until months later. And by then the impact had compounded.
Yep.
And that really brought to my attention the importance of this work. Yeah. Because here I was now unable to operate effectively, unable to show up for myself day to day for my clients, unable to operate my work, which I love. Yeah. And none of my tools were working.
Yeah.
And so I decided I'd always wanted to do trauma and somatics, but I decided to do it at that point because I knew it could help me. And then it could also help me be better at the work that I do. But that was what brought me back into the awareness of trauma and how important this work is.
Going through it yourself.
Yeah. Going through it myself again, and having the courage to admit to myself, like, wow, that actually had a huge impact on me.
Yeah. Yeah. To be able to say with honesty to ourselves, that was really hard.
Yeah.
I'm really hurting. You know, personal development teaches us techniques for moving beyond. And sometimes that means that in our cleverness, we teach ourselves to disconnect from what's real in an effort to create something new. And being able to create something new, it's really good. It's really useful. And also being able to name and be with what is just as important. And there's that part of it, right? It's like, wow, this is big. This is a real thing. It's really impacting me. Okay, where do I need to turn to get the support that I need? Oh, there's a way out. And what were some of the things that helped you in what you learned as you dove into this world?
Yeah, I think recognizing the impact, number one. And I think part of that, you know, is ego, because I've been in this work for so many years, doing this work for so long, that like I should be able to get my way out of this. But then recognizing that this trauma is actually affecting me in different ways than I've been affected in the past. All thanks to the work that I have done up until this point in my life. Yeah. But for me, I already had the awareness that trauma is not just mind, that my life's work and my journey has already shown me that. Yeah. And so I went to work on all of it, mind, body, spirit, through a lot of body workers that are different types of modalities, just to start moving through some of that impact in my body that's stuck in the soma and my mind, you know, being able to talk to people, talk to the right people who will listen, and also continuing to just remain connected spiritually and having that faith that this is also something that I can get through. I just have to go through it.
It's so important to have that tether.
Yeah.
You know, like
that's a good way to say it. It really is a tether.
Yeah. Like I know I can get through this, and there's like something greater than me that I can remain connected to. You know, there was a quote, I was reading a book on reflexes and early childhood development last night before going to bed, and there was a quote from Peter Levine that I read that was captured somewhere in that, and he was talking about how the process of healing often comes along, like it coincides with like a spiritual awakening of sorts that can happen through the process of healing from trauma. And the way that we become different in the process of like meeting our pain and our suffering is actually quite profound. And the result of that is actually quite profound, because we come out the other side and we're no longer who we were when we went into the experience. It's like a ceremony in a way. You go in, and when you come out, you're like, wow, something about me is a bit different now. And it's the same with trauma and the healing process around it. There's we change fundamentally in the process. And I think our neurology, the way that our body responds to sensory input, begins to change too. Because there's that memory of sensory input, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I want to get to the basics just to simplify this, because I think there's just a lot of talk around trauma. And it's not all great talk. It's not all like truth talk. There's a lot of bullshit talk, but let's get really, really basic, and let's just talk about what trauma is so people have a good understanding.
Well, it's the living memory is what I like to say. But I like Gabor's quote a lot. It's trauma comes back as a reaction, right? It's not what happened to us. It's what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us, right? So we can think about it. Our body has reflexes to things, and trauma is almost like a reflexive response to sensory input that's similar to the moment when things were too much. Right? It's anything that's too much or happens too fast for our system to process, whether that be our nervous system or our body in some way, shape, or form. And that can include our mind. Right? And then it's things that happen that compound over time, like chronic conditions, things that impact our development early on in life. But the simplest way of thinking about it is it's the living memory of something that's no longer happening, but our body still behaves as though it is.
Right. Yeah. I really liked when we were talking about it in the Trauma and Somatics program about and Peter Levine writes about this a lot, like too much, too fast, too soon.
Right.
Because I think back to every trauma that I've experienced, and it's always been that. And it's that overwhelm to the system, to the mind, to the soma of like, whoa, wait. And I can't, it's like there's a glitch in the matrix. And then you get stuck in the glitch.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good way of putting it. You get stuck in the glitch. And so much of like clinical psychology thought about it or defined it as something in the mind, or a way like a something to do with the thinking processes. And our thinking processes change for sure, but it's like there is no difference between the mind and the body. The brain and the body is like they're all completely connected. Right? The tissues respond to environment as a result of the way the brain interprets the signals, and so on and so forth. Right. So anything that overwhelms the body overwhelms the mind, and the mind expresses it. Right. The way a person's thought processes work is a good reflection of how their body's functioning.
Yeah. Well said. It's like the mind-body connection is something that I became hyper aware of when I was coming to terms with my addiction back in 2012, and I hit rock bottom realizing, okay, actually, I think I'm an addict. And I started to focus on my body, because the thought of going to therapy at that point when you're an addict, I had so much shame. I didn't want to talk to anyone.
It's a major one.
It's hard, but I knew, but I can go to the gym. Right. You know, I could go to a hot yoga class and just stay silent and try and work through this. But that was when I really understood like the power of the mind-body connection, that there is one. I remember I'd never done yoga in my life, and here I am going to hot yoga. And at the end of class, I would lay in savasana and I would cry. Quietly, but I would cry. And I had never tapped into that part of myself before, and it wasn't that I was making myself cry. It just came out from the movement. And that's I like that distinction that you're making there. It's not that I made myself cry, it's that it was coming out as a result of some of the movement that you were doing. And this is really important for people listening to understand. And this kind of plays to a bigger conversation around our strategies that we use to help an individual as practitioners. But when the thing emerges naturally, we want to make space for its emergence to occur without stimulating it a whole lot more, right?
But there are a lot of strategies and techniques and practices, interventions that their sole purpose is to stimulate that kind of a response with the assumption that that response equals some kind of healing or resolution. And I think the misunderstanding comes from that response sometimes occurring on the journey. Right? So we think, oh, that occurred on the journey. This journey led to somebody feeling better. If I stimulate that thing, then maybe then I'm going to help healing. But we're misunderstanding the whole arc of the journey.
Right.
And instead picking out one piece of the arc and trying to lean on that. But what you said was really so important. In the moments when I've been overwhelmed and I've allowed the tears or the emotion, whatever it is, to move me, instead of me forcing it, right? And I've gotten my mind or my resistance out of the way. I felt a different kind of relief on the other side of that than I have when I've stimulated it or I've tried to control it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. I fully agree. It's like the practice of, like, for example, I'm very in touch with my emotions. My husband's very heady, so we operate very differently. So for him to access emotions, he has to stimulate that to come out of him. And so he can do that through setting a timer, putting on some sad music and like just being with it, and it'll stimulate the emotions to come out. Whereas I could lay on my mat, do some stretching, go to a tough yoga class, or go work out at the gym and do some really hard workout, and all of a sudden something just emerges through me. I think both have their place depending on where, how we hold our emotions. But I do agree in that I think we're seeing too much of the stimulating. I'm a big fan of breath work. This is just one example. Huge fan of breath work. I love it. It really supports me. And it's really important to understand that there's different forms of breath work, different breath patterns for different things. And there's a lot more emphasis on the activating breath work patterns. I feel, for egoic purposes. But if you have someone coming to a breath work, like a holotropic or something, a breath work session, and they have been dealing with a lot of trauma and they go through the session, like, you could easily be reactivating the trauma, and not in a good way.
That's right. And that's the key point there. Not in a good way. I think that's commonly misunderstood. Ooh, the person is having a really big experience. This is a good thing.
It's a release.
Maybe. Right. It's a release. Maybe. Or maybe we're just re-triggering the person and it's too much for their system to manage. And it's that subtle nuance of how much is enough for that unique individual's body on that day in that unique moment. Because it changes moment to moment, day to day, and person to person. Right. And that nuance it can't be taught in a weekend workshop or in a short training. It takes time for us to really understand that. And I think a depth of study of the human body and the way the different systems function together. Yeah. But if we're not going to go to that depth, at least an understanding that it's different for everybody. Part of our frame around being trauma informed is understanding the unique complexity of an individual and the differences that exist from one person to another, and taking that into consideration. Like, well, this person needs a whole lot less. This person, maybe they need a whole lot more. Or this person can tolerate a lot, but wow, that other person can't tolerate anything. It doesn't mean anything about them. It means that that's the capacity of their system in that moment.
Or they can tolerate a lot, but do they have to?
Correct. Exactly. What
Story
happens
of
when
my
they do
life.
less? Right?
Type A.
I get that.
Right?
I went all in on all sorts of experiences, and I chased the big experience for a long time. And then I realized, I'm okay, I can do that, but what is there really a benefit to this? And the more I focus on the subtlety, the more my range grows. It's really fascinating. And there's another thing. You were kind of using you and Kevin as an example of the differences between you two. Yeah. And there is a difference in the biochemistry of a man versus a woman, right? And the differences in the way that our bodies respond to things, and it may not be entirely based on gender, but there is a difference in the biochemistry of the way we process experience. Yeah. And then cultural traditions, right?
Of course.
Right. Cultural traditions really dictate men withhold that stuff because they're not encouraged to learn to process it. But when we get really quiet or slow down, and it's not that we have to move slowly, but when we're with ourselves and we get used to being with the subtlety of ourselves, those things can emerge.
Yeah.
Women are more predisposed to that because of the hormonal balance in your bodies. It's just different than ours. But we as men, we can connect to those things.
Yeah.
It's there.
Yeah.
We just have to pay attention in a different way.
And that feels like that could be a whole other conversation, but for men's work to, maybe it should be more about the quieting down versus the yelling and the rah-rah. Like, let's push the trauma to the surface and deal with this. And it's just a lot of brute force that I feel is unnecessary and leading us in a backwards direction. When really the only way through is going inwards, is being quieter, simplifying, creating more spaciousness. At least that's what I've learned, on my own journey from having no space to creating space and understanding that it's within that space that I get to experience the complexities of my emotional range.
That's it. Yeah. Well, mystics everywhere, all around the world, in all traditions, at some degree or another, the more obscure mystics, what they talk about is that space. I love Alan Watts, his lecture around this. But it's like a clip of one of his lectures, and I wish I knew exactly which one it was so I could cite it here. But he talks about being a musician. I understand this. He doesn't say this specifically, but rest is also a note in music.
Yeah.
And rest is the gap between the notes. Without the gap between the words, there isn't a cadence to my speech, and it just blends, right? And without space between the notes, we just have one long tone, right? But it's sound, silence, and the silence defines the sound.
Yeah.
Right. And we can take that and kind of apply that concept to the experience of being a human being and being alive. It's in those moments of stillness in the space between the movement when we really get to know the movement itself. Right. And so I think that it's imperative that men and women both, but if we're, kind of talking about the masculine movement for a moment, that they're able to be with, the cultivation of the stillness also cultivates the range and the ability to be in that more intense part that comes more naturally to a man's body. Right? We do need to lift and move heavy shit, that's just the thing. We've got testosterone, we need to be able to do that. But that's not all of it. And that's not the essence of what it is to be a man, that strength. It can show up in a lot of other ways, and we need that range, because how else do we show up in partnership?
Yeah.
And able to hold a container for the ocean that is a woman's emotions, right? Like, we can't if we can't be with them in ourselves first. And I'm speaking specifically about masculine feminine dynamics here, but I think that applies to the way that shows up in same-sex partnerships too.
Of course. Yeah. We need both. We need the rest, and we need the notes. And that is what helps us create even a deeper understanding of the emotional landscape.
Absolutely.
It's interesting because as a coach, I'm a classically trained coach under an ICF regulated school. And that's pretty rare nowadays.
I noticed that. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. Like, I had to go to a college to learn coaching, and it was ICF regulated, which was kind of a pain in the ass because you had to follow all these rules. But it really taught me a lot. And one of the things that stuck with me was the power of silence. And very soon after becoming a coach, I was introduced to Rich Litvin. I believe it was his book I picked up first. And immediately after that, I started volunteering at his events. And then I worked from being like just a volunteer to being one of the group leaders. And so I would go to his events and be the group leader, because I had so much respect for that man. I've never seen someone hold such a long note of silence with clients and wait for the wheels to turn for them, or just allow them to have their process. And I always felt like it was like watching a genius at work. And I got really comfortable in the spaces of silence with clients very early on. And I also noticed myself in the uncomfortable moments of silence where I felt like I needed to prove myself as a coach.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what coaching overall has become. It's become this like, let me prove to you that I can fix you, I can heal you. I mean, this happens in the plant medicine space too, in other areas of life and personal development, but we're seeing this happen more and more, and less honoring of the spaces in which people really need in order to heal. Which leads me into the next part of the conversation, which I feel is so, so important. Because I was aware that there was a difference, but I wasn't conscious of what that difference was until I took the program. And that is the difference between being trauma aware, trauma informed, and trauma trained. And it's like I knew it, but it was so nice to hear words put to it. And I really think that this is a conversation that needs to be had in any coaching program.
Yeah.
In any form of facilitating, like if you're learning how to facilitate whatever it is, you need to understand the difference.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the differences.
Yeah. Well, the average person is aware that trauma exists.
Yeah.
Right. We've read a book, or we've heard somebody talk about having a bad experience, or somebody in our life or in our periphery has experienced something from trauma. We hear people talk about it in movies. But I'd say trauma aware might even be just a little bit beyond that. It might be I've read a book or two about it, and I have a sense that it's there. Or maybe we could say it's a gradient. Some people have heard the word trauma. Other people have read books about it.
Yeah.
Right. And that would be trauma aware. Like, I know that this is a thing. Some people consider that trauma informed.
Right.
But we don't know what we don't know until we do. And it's when we're in that not knowing and coming from good intentions that we accidentally create harm. And trauma informed is a big jump from that. It's really, truly understanding the way the human body works, knowing what it looks like in an individual, especially for those of us who are helping professionals. We know, oh, that person's experiencing the symptoms of trauma. I know what the symptoms of trauma are. I know what they look like in their body. I know what they look like in my body. I know what to do right now. I know that that's a place that, unless I'm extensively trained, I don't dig. Right? And no matter how good intentioned I am, no matter how much I think I've been there before,
right,
I don't go there, because I respect the potency and the nuance of what might happen if I do. I recognize that, oh man, if I jump in there without the skills, it's like starting a fire but not being able to put it out.
Yeah.
And that could wreak havoc on that person's life. So I bring an element of care into the work that I'm doing with that individual. And I know, essentially what we're talking about is knowing our scope as practitioners, and really understanding that as a coach, unless I have extensive trauma training, I'm not a trauma coach. Trauma coaches, like, no, I disagree. I say that that's way outside of their scope of practice, which is funny because I'm a coach and I'm trained to work on trauma, but I've gone through extensive training to know how to do that. And I still only take specific cases, because I have a reverence for the power that's there in that. And to your point, I think that a lot of people, internet marketing got involved in the coaching industry a while ago.
It kind of took over.
And it did. Yeah.
Yeah.
And internet marketers figured out that they could, what would be considered a consultant, could call themselves a coach and sell themselves as a coach, even though they're more of a teacher or a consultant. And they could make a bunch of money doing it. And so there are these internet marketers with no experience coaching, no understanding of how to lead a person through processes or work with the psyche or work with the body, going out there and claiming to be this thing because it's not regulated. Right? There's no regulation around what it is and what it isn't. And, anyone can be a coach. Just call yourself a coach. If you've done it before, you can help people with those problems. Just take them through what you did before. But what people don't realize is the reason that there's a regulation around therapy is because of the nuance of what happens when we get in there and dig around.
Yeah.
And individuals can have breakdowns, and they can what we call decompensate. Things can get worse. They can become depressed. They can become suicidal. And if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know how to help. And you take a person into an experience or into a situation where they're overloaded and overwhelmed, and then you leave them.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many people come to me saying they've had these experiences with people. So a trauma-informed practitioner really understands the nuance of that and knows how to steer around that and how to create their marketing in a way that they're not using fear or shame or judgment, rather, or pressure to push on somebody's wounding to get them to say yes.
Yeah.
That's just a form of manipulation. And a lot of people do it.
I call it bro marketing.
Bro marketing, totally. I would agree.
Yeah.
And there's a dissociation that a lot of people have to like the impact of their behavior. Right? It's like they're completely disconnected from any sense of responsibility for what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that people learn about the impact of that, not so that they'll feel bad, so that their behavior will change, so that there can be a bit of caring inside of them. So if we have these 3 stages, trauma aware, trauma informed, trauma trained is extensive training. It's a person who's they've not just gone to school, but done extensive hands-on training and consistently receiving supervision. And that's regular feedback from a highly trained professional that's helping them to analyze what they're doing well, what they're not doing well, and to learn how to do better. And that's the category I fall into. There are many people in the industry that claim to be trauma-informed that are not.
Right.
And
Agreed.
And there are many trainings that are offered out there that claim to be offering trauma-informed training that aren't.
Right.
And so to offer this kind of an experience, it really requires the leader to embody these principles. I can teach information all day, but if I'm not embodying the things that I'm teaching, you're not really learning what I'm teaching. You're learning how I'm behaving. And there are a lot of coach trainings out there that the leaders are behaving one way and teaching their students to do something else.
Oh, 100%. The dissonance is really thick.
It is. And what do you think the students are going to do? They're going to do what they see.
Yeah.
Monkey see, monkey do. I mean, ultimately, that's how we learn. And I'm grateful to my mentors because they really embody the practices that they've done their best to impart on me. And in that, I'm able to emulate their behavior, not just the words. I'm able to learn the information, but it's the behavior that I want to learn to emulate more than anything else. And so watching them work has been transformational for me over the years. But we created the training because we realized there was this huge hole in the industry. Like people just didn't get it.
Yeah.
And they're selling themselves as offering these services. I can't tell you how many times in of different forums and Facebook groups and other places, somebody will say, I'm looking for a practitioner to help my friend who's dealing with trauma. And I can't tell you how many people will raise their hands and say, oh, I can help. And they'll list their credentials and their energy workers or their coaches, and they don't have any training at all. No formal training at all. And they're meaning well. I told a story. I don't remember which interview it was in, but during an interview, I'll tell a little bit of the story again here. I think I told the story during class. There was a woman that I worked with early on in my career. And I took her into some really deep and intense places inside of herself. And I felt amazing. I thought I had done a great thing. I was so proud of myself. I even talked about it on social media. And I used it to encourage people to come work with me. And it didn't help the woman. Now, in the long term, maybe, but I think no. Instead, what it did was it sent her into a trauma trigger, really deep, in a spiral. And her body, her physiology didn't stabilize for a few months after the experience. I thought I helped her. I was like, yes, I did the thing. She had a huge cathartic release. I was chasing the release. I was chasing the emotional expression. She felt like she was having a ceremony. She got sick afterwards. I'm like, yes, I did the thing. No, I didn't. It was too much for her. What I did was I took her into a state of too muchness, and I wasn't able to contain it, and I wasn't able to support her.
Yeah.
And so I tell that story as a warning to people who are good intentioned, who go in there thinking that they can help to trigger a person to healing.
Yeah.
And it's not through the triggering, it's through learning how to be in a triggered state and feel competent in our ability to be with the intensity of that. That doesn't happen by getting triggered again and by reliving our trauma. It happens by being able to tolerate bits and bits more and bits more and eventually do more.
Yeah.
But it'd be like asking somebody to go and to force them to deadlift 600 pounds or something like that. You know, I mean, you tear your body to pieces or tell them that they have to hold this massive weight and that's how they're going to get stronger.
Right.
And it's not actually. We get stronger from incremental increases.
Right.
It's the best way that we can think about this.
Yeah.
Because the nervous system is infinitely more nuanced than the muscular system, right? But it functions the same way.
It's like repeating the same, too much, too fast,
That's it.
It's just too much for the system to handle in that moment.
That's it. And the system, our bodies have really, really intelligent ways of like strategies for protecting us from the too muchness. And so as we get close to that feeling state, our body has defensive responses that are really intelligently preventing us from ever having to experience the overwhelm again. Well, if we blast through those defenses without the individual's like system being supported, we're right back into the same state again.
Yeah.
And it's too much. And here we are again with too muchness, and then the response to that too muchness over time.
Yeah. And that's what I've continued to observe in the coaching space, because I do get a lot of clients. The ones I accept are the ones that usually experience some sort of trauma from usually a business coach who isn't really trained to listen, to observe. And this person is thrown into this traumatic state through whether it's like shaming from the coach because you're not getting it, because you're not doing it my way, or without even trying to understand why. But complex cases I won't take on. I remember very early on in as a coach, very early on, one of my first like 6-month one-on-one clients. And back then I was focusing on like self-love. I was helping women learn how to love themselves. That was my primary focus. And that was what she came to me for. What she didn't tell me was that she had been bulimic for 19 years. So I was completely unaware.
Yeah.
I also wasn't doing as in-depth of an intake form as I now do. It's very extensive.
Yeah.
However, in our 6 months together, she gave me a card at the end of it. And still to this point, I didn't know about the bulimia. And she mailed me a card after her experience and said, I am for the first time free of my bulimia. And it's been 19 years. And I read the card and I was in shock. So I was like, wait, I didn't sign up for that.
Yeah.
And holy shit, this could have gone like really bad.
Yeah.
But it didn't. So thank God.
Yeah.
But that experience alone taught me like, okay, better intake forms, ask more questions at the beginning to really gain a good understanding, and like also understand why she wasn't able to share that with me. Everything to just help improve myself as a coach. But I would also notice myself early on as a coach, I just want to help everyone.
That's it.
And I'm a former addict, so I can help addicts.
Right.
No, I can't. And I would never say yes to that. But I was asked a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, I know for a fact what I did isn't going to work for you because I have a totally different story.
Yeah.
I don't have a 10-step formula, you know?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people just, they get caught in the idea of wanting to help people, but also they get caught in the idea of claiming that they've helped people get through this. Like there's an ego thing. And then social media doesn't help because everything has become overly dramatized with the videos and reels that people show. And look at this breathwork experience with this client who's crying and bawling and having this super intimate experience with themselves. And I'm going to show it on social media. But what happened afterwards?
That's right.
And was that? No, we don't. But we hear about it afterwards, as I'm sure you do.
I have, yeah. People will come to me saying they're still dealing with the aftermath inside themselves from experiences where they were pushed too hard or pushed too far, or forced. I use that term loosely, but directed would be a better way of saying it, to relive their trauma. And exposure therapy was believed for a very long time to be the most effective treatment for trauma.
Right.
And
for a long time,
for a long time.
Yeah.
And still even today, in some circles, it's believed to be an effective treatment. And it's not that I'm in disagreement entirely, because somatic experiencing, which is what I practice, is a form of exposure therapy. It's how we expose an individual to a memory of something that matters. It's not whether we're going to do it or not. It's how we do it, and that nuance is the most important part of it, right? Because people make the assumption, like I said earlier, that going into the thing or chasing one of the symptoms or one of the byproducts along the way is what's going to do is what's going to cause the healing or help with the integration of that. But it's not really. And it's nuanced to the degree that we want to make sure the individual has the capacity, their body, not their mind. Like, a person will tell you, I can do this. We need to be able to pay attention to whether their body can or not. Right?
Yeah. I've learned that at the gym a few times.
Right. And the gym is a perfect way of explaining this. Because we can try to override with our mind, but our body is like, nope.
Yeah.
Or we end up hurting ourselves. And I've done that too.
Yeah.
I can totally do this. I can do this. Oh, shit. I'm out for a week.
Exactly.
And I couldn't actually do it. Just because we think we can doesn't mean we can. And just because our clients think that they can do the thing doesn't mean that they're ready.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to, adopt that Hippocratic oath of do no harm, right? To support an individual. And that requires a massive amount of integrity, or integrity defined as our willingness to pay attention to what the individual in front of us needs and not what our agenda is.
Yeah.
Right. And, I think influencer marketing, or the idea of there being an influencer role, that's now considered a form of an employment status, influencer. Well, that inherently, unfortunately, has created people who do things for the response.
Yes, they do things for the gram.
They
do things for the immediate sense of validation, for the instant gratification, for the positioning, for the optics, for the perception.
For the numbers, for the perception. That's right. So it's all part of creating an image. And there are a lot of people that are really great at motivational speaking and creating images, but it doesn't mean that those people that we see who are good with words are good at supporting other individuals. And oftentimes they're not.
Yeah.
But I think that, some of that has created the byproduct of these things.
100%. I wrote about this coach in my book that I worked with that's more of an influencer. And it was a very enlightening experience. And I remember having missed calls on their part because they would forget or overbook. I remember promises that were not delivered. A lot of photo ops in person, but not a lot of depth.
Yeah.
And I didn't want the photo ops. I didn't sign a waiver. I didn't you didn't ask permission.
Yeah.
And then I remember one of those photos being used as an ad, and I saw it on Instagram, and it was me. And it's like, one, I didn't give you permission to take photos in our intensive, which was just me. Two, this was not a good experience for me. I didn't leave feeling good about it. I reached out to you about it and wanted to talk to you about it, and you didn't reach out back, but you're going to use this photo of me and try and use our story to capitalize on your business. And I reached out to him immediately and I said, you and your team need to take this down because this does not, one, I didn't give you permission, and two, it doesn't explain the whole situation.
Yeah.
I didn't have a good experience.
That self-advocacy that you have, unfortunately, not everybody has. Put it that way.
I totally recognize that. And and that's what I've seen in when people come to want to work with me.
Same.
They unfortunately, and mind you, a lot of these situations that they walk out of, whether it's a coaching group program or one-on-one dynamic, they didn't feel safe enough to express how they felt because, and I've heard this story more than once, someone being shamed in front of the group.
That's right.
You know, on a group call.
We've heard that
and
too.
So not feeling safe enough to express how they really feel in fear of being shamed again or canceled. I've heard of, especially during the super, super polarizing times that came after 2020, someone asking a question in a male coach's group and then being automatically kicked out for asking the question.
Right.
When it could have been discussion. And so there's like the re-traumatization and the ego-led coaching, which then puts you in this position of being out of your scope of practice. But I've also noticed coaches, facilitators, practitioners projecting their own traumas into the spaces and containers that they hold.
Yeah. Teal Swan's a good example of that.
Oh, yes.
I don't know if you saw the documentary.
That could be a whole other...
we could do a whole episode on that.
Let's just dissect this documentary.
Oh my goodness. I watched it and
It's hard to watch.
Oh, it was really hard.
Yeah.
And the thing is that a lot of people do that.
Yeah.
I can point at that one and feel comfortable pointing at that one because enough other people have pointed at it already.
Yeah.
But I do know people who do things in similar ways where their interpretation becomes rule.
Yes.
And they tell people what they're experiencing instead of ask them questions. And it's unfortunate because in that egotistical, well-intentioned, I still think it's well-intentioned.
100%.
But it's just ignorance. And that well-intentioned ignorance, they end up not doing the thing that they're setting out to do. And they don't know any better. And so hopefully by talking more about it and by educating people, we can help those people to learn and to know better. Because it's like, I don't want to sit here and sound like I'm better than everyone else, more of just as a contrasting of what not to do and what in the direction to move towards, which is this, we have to change to be able to be the kind of leader that can lead from that place of humility, of curiosity. And when we get that feedback of this isn't working for me, really, really, really get our rightness and our defensiveness out of the way so that we can truly hear it and go, wow, this isn't working for you. I thought it would work. Okay. What do you need?
Yeah.
Like really hear that kind of negative feedback of like, I really didn't like that experience. Like I've had clients that have said, well, I really didn't like that. Thank you so much for telling me. What do you need instead? Like, I want to know. Yeah. Because that's how we maintain the relational connection. And here we go again with a therapeutic concept that would be really useful for coaches to learn, which is attachment. Right? And attachment really, just to sum it up for the listener, it just signals or signifies how we bond with each other. Like there's an attachment between you and me. And it's important that, well, it's useful, maybe not important, but useful for me to understand that that's real and that exists and that I have an influence over that. Yeah. And if I do something that causes some sort of rupture to that I can also do something to create a repair. And when we're not trained to notice those things, we don't notice them. And we're not working to create some sense of relational safety. Yeah. But there are a lot of people that say that this is a safe space.
Yeah. Too many.
Too many. But, for the person that's really defensively oriented to the world, traumatized, this is a safe space sounds threatening. Using those words instead of creating that kind of a space sends the signal to an individual that it's not safe.
Right. And it's like when you walk into a room and there's something about that room that immediately helps you feel safe versus when you walk into a room and there's a person in that room saying, this is a safe room, but you don't actually immediately feel safe in your body.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting because the safe space conversation popped up a lot after 2020. I think it was through the BLM movement, the safe spaces and that conversation. And there is no safe place, or there is that whole conversation in itself is nuanced as well.
It is. Yeah.
We cannot control how safe someone feels.
That's right.
In a space. We can do our best to create what feels safe. But a lot of that is also the embodiment of the work. That
is, right. We can take steps to engender an environment of safety, but we cannot create safety.
No.
And especially for an individual that just inherently feels like there's a threat all the time.
Yeah.
We can't do something about that. We can be sensitive to it though, right? It's like the both and.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I can be sensitive to the difficulty that the individual in front of me is experiencing, and I can recognize it, and I can take steps to repair ruptures or micro ruptures that occur. And I'm also not responsible for their feeling of fear. I'm responsible for my behavior with that.
Yeah.
Right?
And I can
so
notice
nuanced.
it in them. Like I can be responsible for noticing.
That's right. Right. Well, and when we're facilitating group experiences, we can be paying attention to everyone in the room. And the person that looks like they're having a hard time, we can create a moment to support that person without calling them out.
Yep.
Right? Which is often not what happens. You need to confront the thing.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not that way.
Yeah.
And maybe not in front of everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe in a soft way that engenders that sense of like, oh, I can relax the defensiveness in me. Oh, now I can confront the thing that's there. But as long as the defensiveness is there, there's no way that we can confront the thing.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I first started sitting in ayahuasca ceremonies, I was sitting in more of the neo-shamanistic type circles where, everyone's kind of free to express themselves. But I would often feel impacted by someone else's expression. And it would just create this really weird dynamic in the ceremony space where now I'm not able to drop in, or other people are being impacted, and there's this one person or two people and everything's trying to be held in the space. Yeah. And then I sat in the Shipibo way, and I noticed how in Peru, in the Shipibo way, if someone is actually like really going through it, the maestro will want them removed and then send someone to work with them and chant to them. Yeah. But like remove from the space so they can actually get their attention and the prayer and the ikaros, and it's not disrupting the rest of the space. And I remember the first time seeing that, and I was like, wow, this actually feels safer.
Right, because people aren't pretending like it's not happening.
Yes.
They're handling it.
Right.
It's like, oh, you noticed that. It wasn't just me that noticed that. Great. Somebody else is paying attention.
Yes.
So I don't have to.
Yeah. And that we see that in like the group, other type of group facilitations, events, when someone has a very triggered experience at an event, because it can happen at any type of personal development event. Like just because the exercises seem a little vanilla, like doesn't mean it's not going to impact someone else in the room in a really traumatizing way. A lot of stuff can come out.
Or activating even. It may not even be traumatizing. It might just be activating.
Super activating.
But it could be traumatizing.
Yeah.
Not to say it's not. But just recognizing that in those moments we want to attend to that person. All right. It just reminds me of last cohort of Trauma Somatics. We had, there was a point where somebody was just really feeling intensely during one of the classes, and I paused and I attended to it. And I made space for that person, and I made time for them, and I listened and I asked questions, and I was with them. We were with them as a class. We didn't just ignore it. We didn't just leave it happening in the background where everybody could see that it was happening, but didn't talk about it. We attended to it. And I think those little moments make all the difference in the world. They that'll change somebody's experience.
Yeah.
It's like, the facilitator's paying attention. Oh,
that is facilitation.
right.
Yeah.
We're not facilitating facilitating an experience kind of. There's a workshop. I'm the facilitator, but really, I think what a lot of people think that they are is the motivational speaker.
Yes, 100%. I remember when I was doing my 3-day events in LA, and it was the first event I did the first year one, and it was my first time doing it. And it was 100 people in the room, and I was just like, okay, here we go. Here we go. Right. You know? And there were a few people that were having moments. And there was one in particular, and I was like, this needs to be addressed. It doesn't fit into the schedule, but fuck the schedule.
Right.
And so I called an extended break and tended to her myself. I made sure my team were aware of her. Yep. Allowed her the space to really express what she was feeling and experiencing, gave her options. And that's what felt right and in integrity for me. And sure, my flow was a little disrupted, and sure, the schedule was pushed and off, but it didn't feel right to do it differently.
Yeah, because in that moment, that's what mattered.
Right. And I think that's the thing. It's like, are you willing to shove aside your expectations, or you had said your agenda, enough to really look at the people that you're serving?
Yeah, that's it. And for us as practitioners, in every moment that we're with a client, learning that sense of flexibility is essential, I believe, because, that's what makes, to reference the name of what you do, that's what makes our leadership potent.
Yeah.
Right. It's what brings that potency to it. It's this moment requires me to set aside any agenda that I had for my client's experience or expectation of an outcome, and really just be with what's here.
Be with what's present.
And so what I've done is I've made that my agenda now. My agenda is simply to be with what's here. Now, I may have an idea of what I want to do with an individual. I may have a plan or an arc that I want to create in the work with them. But in the moment, I'm flexible, because if I'm not, that rigidity can lead to something unplanned or unnecessary happening.
1,000%. And that's not even like how coaching works. Yet a lot of people think, it's interesting, because I'll get clients, I'll be on a possibility session with them, just exploring the possibility of working together. And they'll be like, hey, so how does this work? What's the flow?
Right.
What can I expect? And I'm like, you're going to lead the calls. Yeah. You're going to lead the sessions. Yeah. We'll have intentions. We can have a goal. And session to session, it's going to flow with whatever is present.
And that's what coaching is. I mean, but you and I went through a traditional coach training.
Right.
And a lot of coaches have never been through a traditional coach training.
Right.
So they don't even understand the method of asking questions.
That's
and
the
giving
thing.
Space. Instead, they're teachers, or they're consultants,
advisors, or they're just a human being trying to prove themselves.
That's right. Sometimes all of the above.
Check.
Yep.
Yeah. We've been talking about the being in it so much, and this is a topic that is so near and dear to me, because when I first embarked on my journey to sobriety, it had been a long time that I'd been numbing my emotions. And I remember immediately, without these coping mechanisms, no drugs, no alcohol, all I could do was feel. And I would be so overwhelmed after decades of numbing that, and this happened after my marriage with Kevin. I became sober. And there would be days he'd come home from work and he'd find me just starfished, laying on the carpet in our room. Yeah. Because that's all I knew to do in that moment, because I'm so overwhelmed. Yep. So I would just lay down, and I didn't want to think my way through it. I would just experience it and feel it, and it would eventually move through me. Yeah. But that taught me the power of being with things, because I was raised in a home where we weren't allowed to freely express sadness or grief, but we were allowed to express anger and rage. And there's a lot of force that comes with that.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of the energy in my being for a long time.
Yeah.
Whereas feeling and being, it's like, to someone who's so used to moving all the time, it feels deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah. And it triggers this is not safe response in our bodies. And that's the thing. A lot of coaches think that they can work with addiction, but maybe some of them are qualified to do so. But I think that what might be missed oftentimes is just how significant the individual is going to start feeling, just how significant the feelings will be. I guess is what I want to say. Like,
yeah,
everything that we've been turning away from and avoiding is there right under the surface.
Yes.
As soon as the body thaws from all of the numbing that we've been doing, whether it be a stimulant or a sedative, doesn't matter, right? It's still blocking our ability to feel. But as soon as that feeling starts coming back, we need to have some sort of strategy or some sort of technique, some sort of something, and a context to hold it so that we can get through it, because, man, it's going to come back and we're going to have to feel the things that we haven't been feeling. And so we need to know how to softly move through, like, into the intensity of that. And it's best to have support going through those things. Some of us, like you and like me, went through a lot of that on our own. Yeah. But it's still best to have support there. Yeah. Like, I remember stopping using substances and just how much I had to feel too. Yeah. I was almost 100 pounds heavier, and I shed a bunch of weight pretty quickly after I let myself really begin to feel. Yeah. So much of that was me, like my body hanging on to all of that.
Yeah, there's a gentleness that isn't always present when we first start to feel. No. But once we start to learn to feel, it actually feels like a much gentler approach than forcing the emotion.
Oh my God,
through.
Seriously.
Like, to force myself. I mean, I'm all for a rage room. I think they're great.
I think it can be great to express.
Right. I think expressing emotions is great. And I think that there's an importance to being with the emotion. I think that's very, very important. There was one time I was co-facilitating a ceremony and organizing, and one of the people who wanted to come join, she had asked me specifically, she's like, okay, so you say it's Shipibo style, so does that mean that I'm not allowed to express myself? Because I really like to be super vocal in my ceremonies. And I was like, this is not the ceremony for you then. Yeah. Like, and I tried to talk to her she wasn't my client, but just to see, like, what is the need to express in such a vocalized way. Most people feel the need to do that. In my personal observation, most people feel a need to do that because they have felt stifled of their expression. But beyond that, and a layer deeper, is they're actually stifled of the feeling of it. And I think that there's a place for expressing, and there's a much needed place for being with the emotion. And I feel like that's the work that is not being done enough in this space.
Learning to modulate. Yeah. Right. And so there are sometimes people who are repressed, I may invite them to express. But sometimes people who are very expressive, I might invite them to express less. Yeah. Right. And what we're looking for is a middle ground somewhere in between, because, right, there's no prescriptive one way, right? Expression can be helpful, but it can also be the thing that prevents us from really feeling what's beneath it. Like in Raja Selvam's book, The Practice of Embodying Emotions, and he's created a whole model around this for chasing that big expression. That's not going to do the thing that we think it's going to do.
There was, when all of this was going down with my dog last year, actually, this was before that. And I was doing a lot of work around my family constellations. And one of my friends who's in this work of coaching had said, I think you, like, really need to express rage. And I was like, huh. And I'm always curious. Like, I always feel like open to hearing what people observe of me. So I said, okay. And she said, I can hold some space for you. And I went to her house, and she had me go through some practices, and there was no rage. I couldn't find it. I couldn't channel it. It wasn't present. And the more she tried to like push it out of me, the more disconnected I felt from her, and the more I wanted to leave.
Yeah.
Because what I realized after that experience, what really needed to be expressed and what I was really trying to tap into was grief.
Yeah.
And to be witnessed in my grief, because that's something I hadn't had.
Yeah.
And so something that the Trauma and Somatics program really taught me is that ability to observe not just what is coming out of someone's mouth, but what is their body speaking.
That's right. Yeah.
Because the body is always telling us more. And, I could prior to this training, I could notice if a client was like on guard, defensive, or down, but now there's like all these different nuanced expressions that I can notice. I actually find myself more exhausted after a coaching session now, because I feel like now I'm firing up so much more, and I'm noticing and observing so much more.
Yeah.
But it's also really powerful in that now I feel that I can hold better space and have a better understanding of my scope of practice and what's within my scope and my realm of work and what's not, and when to keep asking questions and when to just put on the brakes and let it be. Which is important.
Sometimes we may want to stimulate something, but we want to know why we want to do that.
Yes.
Right. And we want to know, like, well, what is it in this moment that tells us that that's the best thing for the individual in front of us? And in the beginning of learning how to track an individual, I was more tired too, because I was doing more.
Yeah.
But the doing becomes background, kind of like driving a car.
Yes.
Driving a car is a perfect example. Like, we start driving and we're like thinking about
everything.
I'm like, the speed, the mirror, the brake, the gas,
all the
brake,
mirrors,
the gas,
all the
mirrors,
things.
The cars nearby. Where am I in the lane? But eventually now I'm driving. I'm not thinking about any of those things. I'm like thinking about what I got to do later. Talking on the phone, having a conversation. It becomes diffused awareness, but it's still there. Right. And it's the same way, I think, with this work. To that, kind of circling back around to that thought about emotional regulation, oftentimes underneath that, like, intense emotional expression is something else. Yeah. Somebody that's in that habit of expressing really big all the time, oftentimes that's the barrier. It's the strategy to prevent the thing from being felt. I had this client once, and we would get to a certain point in some of the somatic type work that we were doing, and the tears would show up. And it was the same sequence every time. And I would recognize the sequence, and we let the sequence play out over and over again for a period of time. It was a couple months of our work together. And then finally, I had them in town for an intensive, and while they were here, I said, what if you resisted the tears? This isn't a cue that I'm always going to give somebody. Right. But for this particular individual, the tears prevented that activation cycle from really finishing what it needed to do. And by resisting the tears, something magical happened. Something new happened. They accessed this totally different layer of emotional experience. And their capacity to be with themselves just grew. And it was a really beautiful experience. Raja talks about some of this in an example in his book, which is why I mentioned it earlier. But the act of knowing when to intervene is so paramount to the person's experience, and knowing when to resist something versus when to stimulate it. Yeah. Like, man, it makes all the difference in the world. And it's the same with coaching, right? Knowing when to ask the question and when to wait. And when to let that silence just echo. Yeah. I learned how to do that early on too, because of coaching and Rich's work, and just watching him work was phenomenal. And that gap, like, if we can feel settled in ourselves in that, it's even better. Yeah. Because just just waiting.
It creates an opening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the mind will run, and then maybe there's awkwardness. Maybe there's discomfort, but then something shows up.
Always. Yeah. It's interesting because I've brought that practice into my combo facilitation.
Oh, but that's great.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I've seen all sorts of things happen in the medicine space. Like, may I put hands on? May I do this? May I sing to you? And all the things. And I just stay super hyper aware, observe the client. And I always tell them before we begin, I'm following you. If you want to speak, I will speak. If you want to engage with me, I will engage with you. Yeah. But if you want to sit in silence, I will sit in silence with you. Yeah. And that's it. We have agreements at the beginning. If you want me to touch you, you just let me know. And I find that it allows for much deeper work for them because I am not interfering with their process.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like what we were saying about coaches having an agenda. You could have an agenda. You could have an expectation of how you want a session to go, how you want a ceremony to go as the facilitator, as the coach.
Right.
But that may actually impede the actual client's experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And the journey that they're on.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do that.
Yeah. And I think really good coaching, the coach does very little.
Like, we just ask a few questions.
That's right.
They take the lead.
That's right.
Yeah, it's great. But it's harder than it looks because of the human ego.
Right.
And that we want to help. We want to serve. We want to prove ourselves, validate our skills as a coach,
Absolutely.
validate our worth as a human being for being able to help this person achieve X, Y, Z.
It's one of the reasons why doesn't require, but it's best if supporters have support and somebody that can really supervise them. Like, it's one of the things that therapy gets right. You know, they required supervision. And I'm so grateful that I have a potent mentor who reflects to me the things that I really need to hear most and sometimes don't want to listen to.
Yeah.
You know, but he's willing to offer me those reflections and you've got to look at this.
Especially because clients aren't always going to tell you.
They're not. No.
Yeah.
No. But that supervision, it's invaluable to us because it teaches me humility. It gives me the opportunity to practice humility, rather. And I choose to practice that. I choose to say, you know what, you're right. There's no reason for me to argue with that. I know it's true. It's true. Yes. I don't like that happens, but it's true. Right? I could be honest about myself. But two, I then learn to analyze myself in a brand new way. Yeah. Right. And that means that I can grow and I can help people in a greater way. Like that changes the impact that I'm going to have. And so in a way, I like to play this little game with my ego where it's like, well, you really want to do a good job? Get out of the way. Right. And then I can. I'm like, okay, well, do best by getting out of the way. But I can still use my mind against my mind, but not really against my mind to support my mind. Right.
And having that awareness to be able to do that is super important too. You know, having the willingness and the humility.
But I think humility is a really great skill that we can learn, especially in this profession, right? When I'm humble, I can really learn and grow.
When we're humble, we remain curious. It's like I know what I know what I don't know, and I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
And I live by that.
And I want to learn what I don't know if I can at all possible.
Right. Yeah. It creates better spaces. It creates better service.
Yeah.
We are nearing the end of this episode, but I feel like we could riff forever.
I think so too.
I would love to just have you share a potent truth, something that you want our viewers and our listeners to really take home and take to heart about everything we've talked about.
Well, one of the points that I like to drive home is that healing happens in connection and it happens across time. But it's not just healing, integration, change, any of those things. They happen as a result of connective experiences and they happen across a period of time. Change takes time. There's no quick fix to things. It's something that takes us time. It's taken us a long time to become who we are. And our body it's the conduit for us to experience all of life. And when we can become connected to ourselves, whether that be in connection to ourselves being our sensations, our emotions, our thoughts, right? Our sense of being alive, something magical happens. And the deeper I can move into that in myself, and the deeper you move into yourself, the more likely it is that we're going to connect. And the more present I can be with you. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here today, for being present, for being someone who inspires me, and for creating Trauma and Somatics.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Thanks for sharing your experience.
Yeah.
And thanks for having me here. And it's been so much fun. We've got so much in common on these topics, Ruby. I love these conversations.
Same.
Yeah.
More to come.
More to come.
If you loved this episode with me and Will, be sure to check out the other episodes linked right here. And don't forget to hit subscribe. If you have any questions or comments that you want to share about this episode, please do so in the comments below. And be sure to check back on Monday for a brand new episode of Potent Truth. Aho, leaders.